All right, everyone, we are so excited today to have Erin Bury. Woohoo! It's a webinar. It's just me clapping. But Erin is the founder of Willful, which is the easiest way to get an online will. And they are revolutionizing the estate planning industry and kind of taking something that was really cumbersome and required a lot of kind of legal fees and creating something that's super simple and very important out of it. Erin is the person that I go to for anything to do with PR. Anyone who knows me knows that I am like generally skeptical of PR, but Erin is the only person so far who has convinced me otherwise. And I think she's one of the smartest kind of PR minds that we have right now. So I'm very excited to have her here today and for her to convince me that PR is a growth strategy, which I'm pretty sure she's already done. Welcome, Erin.
Thanks, Sarah. Appreciate it. And on my side, Sarah is the person I go to, as many of you probably do, for anything growth related. So much so that when we were hiring a growth manager, Sarah helped to interview candidates. And the person we chose, Tracy, our amazing growth manager, actually was in the first cohort of Grow Class. So it was really exciting to have her be a part of that. And so Tracy is beside me every day thinking about growth. And so I actually chatted with her yesterday about, okay, help me justify why PR is growth. And she was really helpful in doing that. So yeah, I'm going to run through today kind of PR from a growth perspective. And as I mentioned, I have a bunch of appendix slides on just generally PR and how to do it. But today we'll talk about growth. So first of all, what's my background? So I worked in-house at a startup leading PR when I got out of school. I spent a couple of years on the founding team at BetaKit, the startup publication. And so I saw, PR from the other side as a journalist. I then ran a tech PR agency for about 6 years. And now, while I don't spend as much time as I'd want on comms and PR as the CEO, I still liaise with our PR agency and lead a lot of that strategy in-house. And we do have an external agency now. So just to kick things off, I thought I would just define PR just in case you have that vision of PR as Samantha Jones from Sex and the City, which I wish it was because it's way more glamorous. Really, I define PR as communication between you and your key audiences. So that means earned coverage by media outlets. That's the majority of what I'm going to talk about today, just because I think it's probably the most relevant. But it also includes things like speaking opportunities, whether it's a virtual event or in person. It can include coverage in trade publications. So especially if you're a B2B company or you exist in a very specific niche or niche for the US listeners, trade publications can be really great, or things like newsletters. And thought leadership is a big part of how I view PR for growth. That's writing op-eds, providing commentary, and positioning yourself as an expert. It can also, though, include increasingly paid opportunities like influencer outreach. So a lot of PR agencies who would have typically handled unpaid and organic stuff are now getting more into paid opportunities with influencers, sponsored content, because a lot of media outlets are very much pay to play these days, and government relations. We actually just hired a lobbying firm to help us with things like digital wills and some legal change there. So it'll be interesting to look at PR from a different lens where the stakeholder is the government versus a journalist. And finally, events, but I would probably minimize that right now just because no one's having launch parties or product launches. So I think it's important to talk, especially if anyone who's listening is a very, I am not a data-driven, analytics-minded growth person. I am just not. And so I think sometimes these two sides seem at odds. The brand marketers and the growth marketers are kind of adversarial. But I actually think PR is so instrumental for a lot of the things that growth folks are trying to achieve every day. In my experience over the last 12, 13 years, PR has really been instrumental for building trust and legitimacy. You can't grow your customer base if people don't actually trust you as a brand and trust your product. And having a third party with a ton of inherent trust is a great way to do that. It's also really helpful for making people think you're more successful and bigger than you are. This might not come into play with your customers as much as it does for investors, partners, employees, things like that. But PR definitely can help tell a story that does not have to be true behind the scenes. It's great for showing momentum and growth over time. So, you know, every time I see someone, they're like, oh, Willful's crushing it because I've seen you guys everywhere. And that may not be true, but I think we do a good job of kind of showing growth over time and momentum through our PR coverage and our presence online. It makes people think you're an expert. So especially if you're in a space that's B2B, becoming thought of as an expert in your space is really key. And there's nothing that gets you to that level more quickly than speaking at an event or being quoted by a reputable media outlet. And driving inbound inquiries. So I'm going to talk a lot about this today because I think this is really the crux of why people think PR isn't growth. It's not predictable. It's not like Facebook ads where you can like tweak it and tinker and increase conversion rates, but it absolutely does drive inquiries and inbound sales, partner inquiries, employee applications, and sales from customers. And that's what I'm going to talk about today in the case study. And it also, this is a key one. I had so many potential clients of our agency back in the day who would say, I don't need PR, I make this much per year, and I don't really need PR to do well at my business. I'm like, great, call me in 2 years when you can't hire an engineer because they all want to work at Shopify or Hubba or Wattpad and these other companies that have built amazing employer brands. And, you know, so even if you don't want to do PR for growth, I would, you know, recommend doing PR for other reasons like employer brand over time. So this is what Sarah would say to me, but PR isn't growth. PR is not growth, right? And while I obviously agree that PR fits way more firmly into the brand marketing bucket than it does into growth, I think PR supports growth and should be a part of your growth engine at your company. And here's my reasoning. First, PR is amazing for SEO, which is, you know, if you're a search-based business like ours, the first thing people do when they need a will is they search online will. So we're always trying to figure out how we can drive more organic traffic, and getting high quality backlinks from top tier media outlets with high domain authority is absolutely one of the best ways to improve your SEO rankings. So it can absolutely be an aid for organic search if that's your growth engine. It's great for driving traffic and sales today. You know, it's not consistent. It's not something like Facebook ads where you're putting in $1 and you know exactly how much you're getting out and you can scale that up over time. But if you have a piece in a media outlet today, it is going to drive traffic and sales. And so growth to me is driving traffic and sales, and PR is absolutely a part of that. And it's also great for driving traffic and sales over time. I'm going to talk a little bit at the end about an article that we had published in the first 2 months of Willful that is one of the top 10 traffic sources of all time for us. One article. So it's not that you just get sales today from an article. Again, those outlets have amazing SEO, and people searching for your product or service are often coming across those articles, and that's their way in over time. So it's traffic today and it's consistent traffic over time. Referrals. Tracy actually mentioned this when I asked her, you know, what's been the most helpful for you, knowing that you're handling things like our email marketing and our conversion funnel and referrals? And she said, you know, PR has been really helpful for referrals because PR obviously creates word of mouth, and it also just drives more customers, which drives more referrals. So that's been a byproduct that she's seen be really positive for her growth efforts. It also aids advertising. If you're someone who is in charge of Google AdWords or, you know, social ads or even paid placements on podcasts, nothing helps those ads like saying the Toronto Star called us the simplest online will, you know, solution in the world. Using logos from media outlets to add trust to some of those ads. Or using quotes like I mentioned. So it can be a way to aid and abet your paid efforts. And it's also just a really great way to vet paid opportunities. You know, often we'll be sitting around like, hey, should we run an ad in X publication? Should we advertise on this podcast? And if we can get an unpaid placement through PR in that publication, we can test whether there's actually a lot of interest or activity from that piece of coverage, and if it is a good place for us to maybe test putting our paid dollars. So PR can absolutely be methodical. You know, I think there's this feeling that PR is an art, not a science, and it absolutely can be. It is definitely not as methodical as something like Facebook ads, but you can make it methodical, right? If you know that you want to test 7 landing pages, provide that link to journalists if they're going to link back to you in their article, or ask them to link back to that page. And target specific keywords. We've been very methodical about, if I'm writing an article for a publication, what keywords I'm using in that so that it ties back to SEO. So it can be very methodical. It can also be trackable. You know, it's not 100% trackable because a lot of it comes through in organic and direct search, but you can absolutely set out KPIs like referral traffic from publications, sales from referral traffic from publications, spikes in direct traffic, and also, you know, the where did you hear about us section of your onboarding flow, or even doing customer surveys that find that out if you don't have that as a part of your onboarding flow. And we know when we talk to customers, PR and seeing us in the media is one of the biggest acquisition channels for us. PR can also be targeted. So let's say, for example, you're like us and you have multiple customer segments. You know, for us, our customers are people going through life moments, retiring, buying a home, getting married, having a child. We don't know which of, let's say, for example, we don't know which of those converts better. We can actually use PR to do some validation and market research. If we pitch today's parent on an article and we pitch a mortgage publication and one of them performs better than the other, then that's a way for us to validate our hypotheses around some of our target market. It can also be very experimental, right? I talked about, you know, testing with organic coverage before investing in paid. So it can actually be a way for your growth manager to experiment and confirm hypotheses without actually having to run a paid test. But I think it is important to keep in mind what PR is not, because if you're just going to take this away and say, okay, PR is the best growth strategy ever, you got to keep these things in mind. And these are things that I've told clients and folks over the years. PR is not predictable. You know, if you were a company that was planning a press conference on the morning of September 11th, guess what? You can't predict world events. You can't predict a journalist getting an assignment that lands on their desk and negating you from being able to cover you. It's not predictable. And so you can't plan for it as easily as you can for digital ad spend. It's not consistent in outcomes. We've been featured in the Toronto Star probably 4 or 5 times, if not more. And one Toronto Star article in particular drives a shit ton of traffic for us. And the other ones were pretty nominal bumps and not much came from them. So you also can't predict what the outcome of an article is going to be. You might say, well, if I just get in the Globe and Mail, I'll get thousands of visits, but you might not see a bump because it's behind a paywall, whereas another smaller publication might drive a ton of value that you didn't expect. So it's not always consistent, even when you're covered in the same publication. It's not 100% attributable. You will never, ever, ever be able to say exactly how many visits came from PR. And you just have to be okay with that and try to put as many KPIs in as you can. It's not a lever you can turn up and down with predictable results. It's not like, you know, Google AdWords or something where you can say, okay, I'm going to double our budget and double our results. It's something that is very unpredictable. It's not cheap. You know, I think the idea is that growth is where we put our paid dollars, and PR is something that is just something the founders or a marketing person does on the side. PR, it's not as expensive as paid channels, but it is expensive in terms of man or woman power. It takes a lot of time, especially if you're doing it yourself and especially if you're doing it well. So I think that's something to remember. And that was it. Okay. So just remember that and you'll be fine. I'm going to try and keep an eye on the chat here, but I know that I also just want to get through content. So I'll pop in and see questions at different times. And please feel free to add them to the Q&A. So usually, as I mentioned, I go through a PR 101, but I actually thought it would be relevant just to do a case study of Willful during COVID, because I think it's really relevant as you start to think about what role PR plays in your growth and marketing plan. And some of the things that we did that I think helped us to be successful during this time that I think are very applicable to everyone listening as you're actually going forward and thinking about how you might be able to incorporate PR into your plan. So, you know, prior to COVID, we definitely had a great media footprint. I mean, you know, we had been featured in pretty much every major publication in Canada. We're focused on Canada, so we don't do any US pitching because we don't operate in the US. So we had been featured in a lot of trade publications, major publications. We'd done a good job. We had all done it in-house. So it was me in tandem with our marketing coordinator, who's also named Erin. We also have 2 Matts, so name diversity isn't super strong at Willful. We're working on it. You know, when COVID hit, we were faced with, you know, fear, like everybody else who owns a business, about what would happen to our company. But we also were in a unique position where we sell wills, and wills are about what happened when you die. And in mid-March, everybody was terrified about what would happen to them personally, to their families. And honestly, marketing wills just felt super tone deaf. And our values at the company have always been about empathy and empowerment, and marketing around the idea of peace of mind and legacy, not around fear and anxiety. So as soon as COVID hit, we just paused marketing. The only thing we kept active was Google AdWords, because our opinion was if you were seeking it out and searching it, then that's fine. But we paused our Facebook and Instagram ads. We paused a lot of our partnership activity because none of our partners wanted to talk about estate planning to their audiences because they felt it was tone deaf. We paused a lot of our paid placements. So that kind of left us sitting there thinking, okay, we can't necessarily market at this time. What are we going to do? And in tandem, we saw a massive influx in traffic and sales. So despite the fact that we actually scaled down our marketing, it was clear that estate planning was top of mind for the average Canadian, because unfortunately, part of creating a will is being scared and anxious. So when a family member passes away, or when Kobe Bryant dies in a helicopter crash, we know there are always those people coming to us, not because they're just, you know, responsible citizens, but because of fear and anxiety. So we were kind of sitting there seeing our numbers go up, knowing that we couldn't market. So we said, what can we actually do that isn't marketing, but that will help us to reach out to people during this time? So the first thing was free printing. You have to, it's not legal to digitally sign a will in Canada. You have to print and ship your will. And lots of people lost access to printers. Like, what millennial or even Gen X or boomer has a printer at home these days? So Kevin, my husband and co-founder, and I set up a printing station at our home in Prince Edward County. We printed 500 wills. Each package was about 50 to 60 pages. So it was a lot of work, but it was of huge value to people. It was a way for us to go out to our unconverted users and say, hey, you know, here's a value add that we can give you. And we also decided to give free wills to healthcare workers because we actually saw a lot of op-eds from hospital administrators talking about the importance of emergency planning for not only Canadians, but for hospital workers because they were at higher risk. So those were kind of 2 things, just as background to the PR campaign, that allowed us to live by our values while still giving us something that we could talk about publicly and to avoid talking to the fear and anxiety. As I mentioned, we saw sales and traffic spike 600% in late March, early April versus the same period a month prior. So we did see, like, part of March and April was just us trying to respond to all of the customer service inquiries, which anyone who's seen a spike like that can probably understand. But our big question that we were left with is, like, what can we do when traditional growth went out the window, right? Like, Tracy really couldn't do a lot of the things that she would want to do or that she was in the middle of testing because it was just tone deaf and it wasn't the right move for us. So that's where PR came in. So why was COVID a great PR moment for us and for many others? Well, similar to how a media outlet can provide trust because they're a trusted third party, it was someone else telling the story for us versus us marketing. So while we couldn't sit there and say, hey, everyone on social, everyone's scared and anxious and they're all turning to get their will, we could tell that story to media who would then tell that story for us and use us as an example of us. So it did allow us to not tap into, but recognize the fear and anxiety based estate planning that was happening without us actually having to say it. It was a topic that was really relevant to the news cycle. So every time I talk to a startup, they say, I email journalists, no one writes back, no one ever thinks that my stuff is interesting. And a big part of what I usually talk about is what actually makes something newsworthy. And the biggest answer is something that ties into the existing news cycle. Journalists are predictable creatures. They're either writing about the same things at the same time every year, Father's Day gift ideas on Father's Day, Canada Day celebrations this week, Christmas shopping at Christmas, or they're talking about current events and trends that don't fit into a certain, day of the year. So COVID was all any journalist was talking about in late March and April. In fact, I talked to a lot of PR friends who said, if you had a beauty company or something that was unrelated to COVID, like you were the opposite of us. You didn't have any opportunity in PR unless you did something interesting to pivot your business model. You were focused exclusively on marketing to your customer, whereas we were a bit the opposite because we had this topic that was really relevant to COVID. We also had data. What makes journalists care about you? Data, which is what growth people are great at. So, we had data not only to showcase the spike in sales and traffic, and we could extrapolate that, compare it to last year, compare it to the previous month, compare city by city. We could also leverage our existing stats that we had on the percentage of Canadians that don't have a will, which is 57%. And some of the other stats that we had. So we had a lot of data to back up our pitch. We had increased consumer interest. So this is something we could paint as a traffic opportunity for media outlets. As growth people, you're focused on data. Well, journalists are also focused on data. They are focused on the number of people who visit an article so that they can sell advertising. So if you can position your story as something that's going to get a lot of interest from the public and that therefore more traffic on their article, they're going to resonate with it more. So we could leverage that increased consumer interest into a reason why they should be talking about it. And then, of course, we just had a feel-good newsworthy angle, right? So yes, more people want wills, and yes, we have data to support it, and yes, it's a problem that people don't have them, and here's something that we're doing to actually try to help at this time. So what was our process? What if you find yourself in, an event happens, or you find yourself at a moment where you really want to go about, getting some PR coverage? What's the process? So for us, it was figure out who's going to handle it. That's really the first step. Are you going to handle the PR? Are you going to hire a freelancer or an agency? How are you actually going to tackle the campaign itself? In our case, we hired an agency called TalkShop, which is amazing. Highly recommend to anybody who's in consumer tech or lifestyle in Canada. If you're in the B2B space, I would recommend Boulevard PR. They're amazing for B2B, and they operate not just in Canada, but outside Canada. Same with TalkShop. We hired them as soon as COVID hit. Like I'm saying, March 13th was the weird day with Tom Hanks and the NBA getting canceled. We saw a traffic spike over the weekend. Monday, I was on the phone with them signing a contract to help us, because the thing to know is that it has to be immediate. When a current event happens, you have to get out there right away and kind of get ahead of the news cycle. So we then thought about localization. So a really big thing to remember when you're doing PR is that you have to have local interest to the people that you're pitching. You can't pitch a Vancouver publication without having some local tie, a local customer, a local set of stats. So for us, we not only have localized stats around who doesn't have a will in each province, and even down to the city level, so that we can say, here's how many people don't have a will in Vancouver. And also a tip, that was something that we did through Angus Reid. I'll put the name in the chat, but that's a polling firm that we use for all of our data that we generate for PR pitches. And happy to share a contact there if anyone is interested. But we pulled all of that local data and our Google Analytics data on things like traffic spikes in different cities into local pitches. So when we were reaching out to someone in Calgary, we had Calgary specific data. So that's something to remember when you're pitching as well. We had provided multiple angles, right? So you can't just go out with one story. More people want wills. That's great, but not every journalist is interested in covering that angle. So when we were reaching out to maybe business reporters, we were actually telling the story about how Willful is handling COVID, the free printing and shipping, the healthcare workers going remote, like all of the things that we were doing as a business. So we had, a few different angles that we would use depending on the journalist. And then if someone said no, we would say, oh, you're not interested in writing about the rise in demand for wills. Are you working on anything related to companies that are going remote, or how small businesses are pivoting to be successful during COVID, or businesses that are thriving during this time? I mean, Sarah knows I had a lot of guilt around being a business that was seeing success during this time. And so, that was something that we talked about as well, like how to reconcile being someone who's thriving when there's so many businesses who aren't. Great question, Gabriella, about whether we shifted budget from TalkShop. We just shifted our paid budget. To be honest, we had a budget we were looking to hire TalkShop later in the year anyways, once we closed funding, which we did 2 weeks ago, woohoo, through the pandemic. But we just shifted budget that we had set aside for Facebook ads and Instagram ads because we just weren't spending that budget anyway. So it was really easy. And we actually hired them on a project basis. We said, listen, we need to invest in this ASAP. I can't commit to an ongoing retainer. Can we do, a $10,000 project just around COVID? And they obviously were really open to that because also agencies were affected negatively by COVID as well. And we also reacted to developments in real time. I think this is really important as well, where, a lot of people will go out with a pitch and maybe not incorporate what's actually happening real time in your industry. So a great example of that is because of COVID, it became very clear that getting your will signed, printed, and witnessed by two people who have to be in the same room with you at the same time is pretty much impossible when you're quarantining or you have COVID or whatever. So the Attorney General in Ontario allowed for virtual witnessing of wills. Well, that was a way for us to then also not just capitalize on this idea that wills were in demand and talk about that, but we could also react to all of these legislative changes in real time. And we had an agency that was already briefed, had our stats, was ready to go. So when we woke up and saw virtual witnessing has been pushed through, they had a pitch out 30 minutes later. So you also have to think about who else is going to be targeting media who talks about the same thing as you. Well, I can imagine no law firm across the country woke up that morning and had their shit together to get a PR pitch out as quickly. And Brooke leaves a comment here that that's called newsjacking. Newsjacking is essentially trying to tie yourself into what's happening in the news cycle. The key is making it relevant. So, if you're a company that makes socks and virtual witnessing gets pushed through, probably not relevant for you. But for us, that was a really great opportunity to offer ourselves up as experts to speak to what this meant for Canadians. So how did it all go? Here's a few headlines. So, some of the articles were just about the rise in our business. Some of them were about just the rush for Canadians to prepare wills. Some of the coverage focused more on the healthcare workers initiative. But all in all, I wanted to share the results from kind of March 14th to April 30th, and then I'll get into some of the actual lessons. So we had, listen, this is also anomalous. Do not expect 60 pieces of PR coverage over 6 weeks. I've never had that for a client campaign. I've never had that for Willful. It was just right place, right time. So we had 58 pieces of unique PR coverage over 6 weeks. And we had an article in Canadian Press. For anyone who doesn't know, Canadian Press or Associated Press in the US are essentially syndication services. They write an article about you, and any media outlet across the country can choose to pay to syndicate that in their publication. publications. Getting an article in the Canadian press is the holy grail of PR coverage because it basically guarantees that you're going to get hundreds, in our case, 300 or 200 and something hits from that one article. But it's very difficult to get in there because they're very focused on hard news. So in this case, it was hard news that people were doing this. So 58 pieces of coverage that range from broadcast news, CTV, CP24, national newspapers like the Globe and Mail, Toronto Star, and a ton of just local regional publications as well, because Talk Shop is based in Vancouver, has people in Toronto, and they have relationships all over the country, which was really key for us. Just to speak to that for a moment, relationships are the currency of PR. And if you don't have relationships and you had tried to do this, even if you were at Willful, you would not have been successful. I would not have been successful because my relationships are with business and technology reporters. When I called Talk Shop, I said, I need you because you guys have relationships with consumer outlets, lifestyle outlets, TV news. I have none of that. So part of the reason this number is so high is because we strategically hired someone who had the existing relationships to be successful. We saw a 287. So just in terms of my growth people out there who want some metrics, here's your metrics. So we saw a 287% spike in organic search traffic over that time period. Obviously not all correlated to media coverage, but absolutely a big part of it. We saw a 132% spike in direct traffic. I know that many of these are associated with media coverage because Tracy and I would literally sit there every single day when something was published and we would look at the spikes in organic and direct, and it was absolutely correlated to media coverage. We saw a 343% spike in referral traffic, and that's obviously directly attributable to each publication. And we had over 5,000 referral visits from PR coverage just in that 6-week period. The impressions, so if you've ever worked with a media outlet, impressions are kind of the metric that they use. I know a lot of growth people probably hate them because they're, to be honest, a lot of BS. Impressions are the number of people that might have seen your article based on the circulation or website visitors to that publication. Yes, they're a little bit of BS, but they're also really great to throw in your board presentations or to share with stakeholders. And so we had millions and millions of impressions and potential people that saw our brand over that time, but those aren't as tangible as the stats that I included earlier. And the day that the Canadian press article, for anyone who's doubting the impact of sales from PR, and mind you, we are a B2C company, so obviously it's a little bit easier for us. We had our highest traffic and sales day ever on April 13th. On one day, April 13th, we did more in sales than we did the entire month of April in 2019. And that was very clear. We actually had 0 referral visits because none of the Canadian press articles included a link back. Cursed, but we saw like massive direct and organic search that day. So it was absolutely correlated and just shows the power of media coverage. And the thing that helps me sleep at night is we gave out over 2,300 plans totaling hundreds of thousands in revenue to healthcare workers. And, you know, while this isn't a growth win, to me, it's a personal win because I really struggled during this time with how do we align with our values, but still take advantage of this moment. And so many of those healthcare workers said, I saw you on CP24, I saw you on CTV Vancouver. So we were able to reach more healthcare workers and get them plans because of PR, which was a big win for me. And where did we end up? Well, in April, we did 3 times our sales that we had in February with almost no marketing. The only money we spent on marketing in April, I mean, I guess you could call printing and shipping a marketing cost, was the PR project and Google AdWords. That's it. And we 3x'd our sales and 10x'd our sales in April 2020 versus April 2019. I do want to highlight that the fear and anxiety has gone down. And so that means that all of this was a moment in time, but that's kind of to me, using PR as a growth strategy also means knowing when to double down on it and focus, right? Like we knew we had a moment in time to take advantage of this, to get into the news cycle, because I'm going to be honest with you, some of you might have sexy businesses. I don't. We sell wills, and it's very hard to get media to talk about or care about estate planning on any given day. So we really had to make the most of our moment in time here. Oh, and Tracy wanted me to add this because I said, are there any other growth stats that you can throw in that will convince the growth marketers that this is legit? So she wanted to point out that we had a 9-point increase in our domain authority because of all of the backlinks from really high quality media outlets. So there's Tracy's seal of approval on the metrics slide. So the lessons that I think we took away and that hopefully you can apply to your own business. The first lesson is that timing matters. You know, if we had hired TalkShop and gone out with a pitch in February about how Canadians don't have wills and need them, it absolutely would not have had the same impact. The timing matters for your PR campaign. If I used to work with Tim at Carnivore Club, which is a charcuterie delivery service, Gabriella will know this well, and he always said, I sell all my boxes of meats 2 times a year, Father's Day and Christmas. And you know, for him, timing matters. If he's going out with a pitch about boxes of meat in September, it's not going to resonate. So know the cycle of your own sales and also understand the cadence and timing and focus of the news cycle. And that's easy. Just go onto the Toronto Star's homepage and look at what are they talking about. They're talking about barbecuing, grilling tips right now. They're talking about takeout and patios, and you know, you can really get a sense of what are they talking about at any time. And you can actually look back at coverage from a year ago to see, you know, how can I actually predict and hack that for next year. Speed matters. I cannot stress this enough. You don't have the ability to sit and plan this for 3 weeks. If we had waited until early April, our competitors would have owned that news cycle. We owned that news cycle. And in fact, our competitors were probably pissed that they saw us in the news as much as they did, because we knew if we were the first person to get this pitch out, we could own it. So being fast matters when it comes to reacting, especially to current events. Localization matters. If we didn't have all of those local stats in markets like BC, we wouldn't have done as well. Having a relevant tie to the current news cycle matters, you know, whether that's, you know, your, I talked to a company the other day who does luxury handbag resale. Well, climate change is a massive trend in the news right now, as is e-commerce. Those are 2 great macro trends that you can tie your PR pitch to. So it's not, hey, I'm Diana and I have a resale site. It's, hey, climate change is a massive issue and everyone's online shopping now, and my company ties those 2 things together. So ask yourself, what are the macro trends that everyone in society is talking about, and as a result, journalists are talking about, that tie to your business so that you can actually speak to the things that they're looking to write about anyways. Get help in order to move quickly. I would never, ever, ever have been able to execute all of this with just our internal team. So it does take a ton of time and relationships. So even if you are an expert at PR, you probably will need to get help to react to something like this. Preparation matters. In the appendix slides I'm going to send you, the first step for PR is not sending a pitch. It's get your key messages together so you know what to say to journalists when you have an interview. Create your media kit that has your who, what, where, when, why about your business, and has photos and potentially even video, so that when someone does write about you, you can answer the question, can you send me high-res photos? Can you send me more about the company? Can I get a login to try it? These are all things that journalists are going to ask for, and most people don't have these things prepared. So when you look at the slide deck, you can actually tackle some of those things so that you are prepared if you have a COVID PR moment. I also wanted just to highlight, like, know the demands that PR is going to put, successful PR is going to put on the business in different places. Our customer service team doesn't like PR because they spent hours and hours on the phone with customers in April and March. And obviously it was a good byproduct of having sales, but it led to massive influxes of customer requests. So make sure that you predict that, right? And that you account for that. And then finally, I just wanted to highlight as well that living by your values helps to paint your company in the best light. I think the reason that we were able to market elegantly through this time is we went back to our core values of empathy and empowerment, and we made sure that we were living by those. I just wanted to highlight a couple, just in case I haven't convinced you growth people that, that PR can be a growth tactic. I thought I'd share a couple stats just from Willful's lifetime. So we launched in late 2017. How has PR helped growth over time? So 75% of our conversions in traffic are from organic sources. And I attribute a lot of that to our focus on PR. Now, you might be the opposite. You might have very little in terms of organic, but when we were raising funding, this is a stat that our investors pointed to as proof that they thought that we had a really great business because we could drive interest without having to spend a dollar. 7 of our top 20 referral traffic sources are from media outlets and articles. That's lifetime to date. One Toronto Star article that I mentioned, it was a column by a personal finance blogger comparing us with our competitor and talking about online wills. If you search online wills, it's the top hit. It sends us a ton of traffic. And the Toronto Star is one of our top 10 lifetime traffic sources since we launched three years ago for that article and some others. And it helped us with SEO. We're the #1 organic search result for terms like online will and make a will, even though, and don't test that right now. I haven't checked that yesterday, and it depends on where you're based, but our competitor has been around for 20 years. So the fact that we were able to overtake that spot through some strategic PR and backlinking is really interesting. And to Elizabeth's comment about the paywall, I don't think they have a paywall on the article about online wills. So paywalls, whole other topic, but yeah, they kind of kill the PR growth hacking, especially in the Globe. We've been in the Globe and seen 0 in terms of direct traffic bumps or anything like that. Still great for stakeholder engagement, not as great for growth. And we've seen increased trust and credibility. Listen, I know that you can't put a stat on that, but in order for you to be able to do your job as a growth marketer, you need people to trust your brand and you need to be credible. And that's really what PR has done for us. And of course, I already talked about this, but it has absolutely led to increased sales, referrals, and also reviews, which have been really helpful for us. And this is unrelated to your growth program, but just for any entrepreneurs listening, I mean, we've had inbound requests from investors, Fortune 500 companies who want to partner, and we get hundreds of applications for each job posting we put out, in part because we have a really great presence in the media and people know about us, and we've built a good employer brand. Okay, so larger PR lessons, less about Willful, more for everyone listening, and then I'll take a few minutes to answer questions. PR is ideal if it matches the behavior of your customers. So we are a search-driven company. If you're not search-driven and you don't think that it's going to be helpful to have media articles increasing your search ranking, then maybe it's not the best fit for you. So the first place to start is, what is the behavior of your customer to get to your product or service? And is PR something that will actually aid that, or is it kind of inconsequential? And I'm just going to focus on it for things like employer brand. It's ideal if your customer segments align with the publications you're pitching. So our customers are parents, retirees, people who are just getting married, or people who are digital friendly. So we can target publications like Today's Parent and know that it matches up. So make sure that your PR efforts are matching your customers, because I had a lot of tech bros who would say, I want to be in TechCrunch. And I'm like, great, but your customers are reading The Kit. So make sure that your efforts align with your customers if your goal is sales. A larger lesson is just that PR works hand in hand with growth. Tracy and our PR agency and I work together all the time with our CMO on how PR fits in, what backlinks we should be promoting that month, what keywords I should be using in my op-ed. So it's absolutely a collaborative engagement, not this adversarial, you're not growth and you don't care about brand marketing relationship that I do see happen sometimes. You got to wait for your moments. Listen, our biggest PR opportunity, and this sounds terrible, is when a celebrity passes away without a will. That's our in for the media, because again, no journalist wants to talk about estate planning on a random Tuesday. So when Aretha Franklin passed away without a will, we were in there right away pitching that. So, you might be thinking, well, what's my COVID moment? Maybe even plan that out. What could lead to a spike in interest, and what are those moments when you see spikes in customer demand? That's likely aligned with when you would have a good opportunity to get press. PR is a long game. it's like SEO. It's not something that you can just start tomorrow and all of a sudden it's a huge part of your focus. I mean, we've been focused on it from the beginning and it's taken a long time to build relationships and to see value from it. So don't expect really, really quick wins, but you can accelerate that by hiring an agency. And again, you know, it's 80% about relationships, 20% about a great story. You can have the greatest story in the world, but if media and journalists aren't opening your email, then it does not matter. And finally, I just wanted to say, hopefully I've convinced you that PR is not fluff. It is really something that can be strategic, methodical, that can assist growth, that can be data-driven, and that absolutely can be an integral part of your growth engine. So as I mentioned, I have a massive appendix here with a ton of info. I'm going to stop there because I know we have questions, and I'll make sure that everyone gets a copy of this deck via Sarah. And thank you for listening, because I know that I just talked for a long time. So I will stop sharing now, and then we can go to questions. So I'll pop into...
Erin, if you can hear me, I've lost audio. Give me just 2 seconds.
No, I can hear you now. Okay, so I have a question here from Brittany about how I can score American PR for a Canadian startup. Do we just try to blend in with American startups, no existing relationships with American journalists, and very little money for PR? Great question. So the first tip that I would have is find some of that localization, right? See if you can find a customer in the US, if you can commission some data points that are specific to the US from a polling firm there. Make sure that you have the localization angle down. Second would be find someone that has relationships. You could probably find a freelancer in the US who could probably just do a bit of pitching for you for very little money, like $1,000 to $2,000, if not less. Maybe you can even barter with them. Like I barter with Sarah all the time for her growth help in exchange for PR help. And then tip number 3 is, and I guess the reason I say try to find a way to hire a professional is that it's going to take you 6 to 12 months before you get any reaction, unless you just have the best story since sliced bread. Our marketing coordinator, Erin, joined on May 1st, 2019, and I think she got her first piece of PR coverage that she secured versus me 8 months later. And I kept telling her, this is normal. That's just the way it is, because you have to build relationships and it takes time. Tip number 3 is subscribe to HARO, H-A-R-O, Help a Reporter Out. It is a daily digest of journalists and media outlets who are looking for sources, and it takes time to comb through all of them and respond to them. But I've gotten myself and clients in publications like, you know, Inc. and other things like that, just because of responding to those requests. So those are kind of three suggestions for getting coverage there. And the other thing, I mean, I have a section in the presentation about how to build relationships with journalists. Make a list of the publications you want to be in, and then follow all of the journalists that you want to target on Twitter and start building relationships with them, right? Like just start following them on Twitter, sharing their articles, commenting back and forth. You can start building relationships with those people now, so that when you actually get an email into their inbox, they're going to pay attention to it. So hopefully that helps. Sarah, I know you mentioned, welcome back, that you have a couple questions from folks. If you want to, I don't think we have any more in the Q&A box. If you have any others that you want to throw out.
Absolutely. So sorry about that. I completely lost Wi-Fi for the last 3 minutes.
That's okay. I just kept going. I figured that's what you want me to do.
You got it. I love it. Thank you. So I've got a couple of questions via email. One of them is from Menno. What are some signs that you should move on from your PR agency?
Ooh, great question. As someone who ran a PR agency and now works with one, listen, I think agencies can absolutely be helpful in helping you hit the ground running, leveraging existing relationships. Signs that you need to move on from them: they are shitting the bed on coverage. They are not actually providing results, or they're providing results that don't align with the KPIs that you set out for them. It's funny because we've now hired TalkShop on a monthly retainer, and I sent them a message this week and I was very clear. Hey guys, just wanted to reiterate the KPIs that we're looking for from our engagement with you. Number 1, referral traffic from consumer outlets that drive sales for us. Number 2, X. Like, I'm very clear about what success means for our engagement. So if it's not going well, maybe try that, regroup and set set out the expectations. But if they're just continually, I'd say 3 things: not available or accessible, takes you a long time to get meetings with them. They don't reply to emails in a timely manner, probably because you're one of their smaller clients as a startup. That's a red flag. Number 2, lack of results. Like if they're, just telling you about all the stuff they're doing, but it doesn't materialize into coverage, it means they don't have the right relationships in place. And number 3, if they're not proactive. Like they should be, listen, I didn't expect TalkShop to send me an email the morning virtual witnessing passed. They're not reading legal publications, but I am expecting them to come to me with ideas around pitch angles, and they absolutely do a great job of that. So if your business is socks and there's some sort of announcement about how every Canadian is mandated to wear socks from now on, that should be something that they're sending you proactively and suggesting ideas. So proactivity, responsiveness, and traction with actual coverage. If there's none of those 3 things, either move on or regroup with them and kind of reiterate your expectations.
Amazing. We've got another one from the Q&A. So how do you validate an agency has the relationships that you're looking for your business? Are there questions that you ask to try to parse that out?
Great question. So I actually include a list of the top 15 questions to ask any potential PR agency in the appendix. And honestly, again, it comes down to be honest about your KPIs. I remember meeting with the head of a very growth-focused VC-backed startup when I was running my agency. And he said, my only goal for this engagement is sales and predictable traffic. And I just said to him, that's great, but that's not PR. And so we very amicably said, this is not a fit because I can't agree to what you're looking for. It's not gonna work. You're gonna be unhappy. I'm gonna be unhappy. Let's just not do it at all. So be upfront with them first and foremost before you even get into the questions about your goals. Maybe it's just getting you some op-eds. Maybe it's securing you speaking engagements. Maybe it's just getting you in front of investors. Be open about your goals and what you will deem as a success. Then how to evaluate relationships. Get them to tell you, who could you pick up the phone and call right now and get on the phone, or someone that would, answer your email within 5 minutes. For any journalist I have a great relationship with, they're either answering my DM on Twitter or my email within 10 minutes, maybe an hour. So that's the question. Number 2, references. You've got to call other people who have worked with them. Like, I know it's really easy to skip this step because we're all busy, but it's going to be the easiest way for you to understand what the working cadence was like and the types of relationships they have. And I guess the final piece is you're not going to know because they're probably going to sell you on it no matter what. That's why it's clear to have it's important to have the KPIs out front and to know and to tell them if you don't have these relationships and if we're not seeing traction, then we're not going to continue working with you, so that if they're smart, they wouldn't get into bed with you unless they did have those relationships.
So I'm basically going to go back to my PR is not growth slide and put an asterisk after it, and then include the link to this talk.
PR can be growth, yeah, for sure. Listen, and a lot of people, I'm sure we're not even approaching it as methodically as we could be. I know there's a guy named Enzo in Toronto who used to work at Wattpad doing PR, and he is so analytical. Like, he has got spreadsheets, he's got keyword, like he sees PR as growth and lives it every day. I'd say we're probably better than the average person, but we're not experts at it. But I think it's helpful to keep in mind how it fits into kind of your marketing pie.
An incredibly fun fact, Enzo is part of this cohort of Grow Class.
Amazing.
So I don't think he's here today, but he's lovely. He's amazing.
Okay, good. Well, then you have an expert in your midst that everyone can turn to for the growth-minded PR aspect.
Amazing. Other than you, of course.
Yes.
Thank you so much for taking the time today, Erin. This was incredible. And I think I can kind of probably speak for the crew here in saying that it is so refreshing to kind of hear someone take down PR in such an analytical, methodical way, and then also such a value-driven way. Like, you were able to do something incredibly difficult through one of the most difficult periods of time in human history, and do it with kind of that grace and the thoughtfulness that you bring to Willful. So that's it's inspiring and it's awesome, and I'm so grateful that you took time to share it with us today. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you for having me. I am by no means the be all and end all in this, but I have been around the block a few times, and yeah, I wish everyone luck with their own efforts. I'm on Twitter or in the Grow Class Slack. If anyone has questions, I'll make sure Sarah gets everyone a copy of the deck, and really appreciate everyone attending and listening, and hope you all enjoy the sun this weekend.
Amazing. Thank you. And just for everyone here, we have a small fun announcement coming next week for Grow Class. So just keep your ears open. Click open on our emails. We'll be in your inbox telling you some more exciting things soon. Thank you so much, Erin. Have a wonderful day, everyone. Stay in your soft pants, even if those are jeans.
I encourage hard pants.
Hard pants. All right. Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.